Honourable Member for Windsor Tecumseh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the 2015 election, the Liberals repeatedly promised voters that they would act to improve the record of Canadian companies operating abroad. In 2016, after the election, the Prime Minister went to the UN and declared Canada's back. He said that Canada would pursue a seat on the Security Council. Then he got an open letter signed by 183 countries and NGOs urging him to do something to address the many instances in which Canadian mining companies were associated with human rights and environmental abuses. 4 United Nations bodies have called on Canada to hold Canadian companies accountable for their operations overseas, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has had 3 hearings on this subject. In January of 2018, the Minister of International Trade held a flashy press conference replete with labor leaders and important stakeholders to announce the government's intention of establishing an office of a Canadian Ombudsperson on Responsible Enterprise, or CORE. It was an impressive photo op, one that presents an air of expectation, of action. The minister confidently declaimed a progressive trade agenda includes Canada's strong commitment to responsible business conduct and the respect for human rights of workers and local stakeholders in Canada and around the world. He continued, the Ombudsperson will be mandated to independently investigate allegations of human rights abuses arising from a Canadian company's activity abroad. So, flash forward 15 months in the 4th year of the government's mandate, and what do we have? After this long wait and much inaction, the International Trade Minister announces that a former petroleum industry lobbyist has been appointed as the Ombudsperson, but that the proposed investigatory powers the government clearly stated that CORE would have were under legal review for a month. Seriously? For years, we've been telling this government what happens when you enact such an office without using a legislative process. You're cutting the powers. It befuddles me to understand how they don't understand the difference in what was done and the concerns that have been raised around the world about this shortcoming. And the Ombudsperson's power is limited to recommending that government withdraw economic and political support for companies that refuse to participate in the process in good faith. New Democrats and stakeholders, as well as the UN, have repeatedly told Canada that this approach simply does not work. It's quite obvious that this government has a very serious problem when it comes to corporate accountability. The SNC-Lavalin saga offered a glimpse into the extraordinary influence that one powerful company can have on Canadian politicians at the highest level. The people of my constituency champion social justice around the world, and they expect the corporations that they patronize and work for to be transparent and accountable when it comes to corporate ethics. So to the government, please inform the Canadian public how and when it intends to honor its commitments fully.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I don't necessarily support the overall characterization that the member is trying to put on the record in terms of this government and what we've been able to accomplish over the last 4 years. We have many strong advocates within our caucus, and it's almost universally felt, Mr. Speaker, in terms of every member of the Liberal caucus, in terms of the responsibility that corporations have, not only within Canada, but going internationally also. We don't necessarily need to be lectured from New Democrats on it. At the end of the day, we have seen in the last 4 years more movement from this government than we've seen with Stephen Harper in the previous 10 years. And the member somewhat makes reference to a couple of the actions and then takes liberty to start mocking them as if it's not going to make a difference. Well, Mr. Speaker, I beg to differ. I believe that the government has taken action. It has fulfilled its commitment. And let me cite specifically, building on Canada's existing expertise and leadership, the government announced 2 initiatives to strengthen Canada's approach to responsible business conduct abroad: the creation of the Canadian Ombudsperson responsible for enterprise, and the creation of a multi-stakeholder advisory body on responsible business conduct made up of experts, including from industries and civil society, to advise the government. In fact, Mr. Speaker, you will find that on October the 8th of this year, we actually appointed Cheryl Hardcastle as the first Canadian Ombudsperson responsible for enterprise, and the first position of its kind in the world, Mr. Speaker. Ms. Hardcastle took office on May 1 and is actively engaged with the stakeholders across Canada. I would like to emphasize, Mr. Speaker, we're talking that this is something unique around the world, as Canada has done in previous administrations, not necessarily Stephen Harper. We have demonstrated that Canada, even though a population base of 36 million people, is often looked at from other countries in terms of having leadership, and this is an area in which I believe that we have demonstrated leadership. Think about it, only in 3.5 years, many different types of priorities and issue areas, and yet we are able to identify this because it is something that we told Canadians in the last election that we would act upon, and we have done just that, Mr. Speaker. We have acted on the important issue of corporate responsibilities. There has been private members' bills that have been introduced from members of the Liberal caucus, current and past, dealing with the corporate responsibilities abroad. And it pleases me, Mr. Speaker, to indicate to the House and to those that might be following this debate, whether it's tonight or it's been over the last number of years, that they will see that we have a government in this current Prime Minister cabinet and National Liberal caucus that is in fact committed for many different social causes. This is but one of those issues, Mr. Speaker. There are many horrific stories that are around the world dealing with corporate abuse or misconduct. Mr. Speaker, we're very much aware of it and wanting to be able to contribute to coming up with the ideas and ultimately lead to solutions that is going to minimize the negative impacts. And this is where I believe that Canada can demonstrate that leadership, Mr. Speaker, and we have done that in terms of the Ombudsperson.
Honourable member for Windsor Tecumseh.
Well, what's worse than that is that we are no further ahead after all of that. The Conservative government had an arrangement that was already in place that was giving us just exactly what we have right now with this. So that is a shame, because there is an immediacy when it does come to the human rights aspects of this issue. Besides the cases that the Canadian courts have agreed to hear, there is a legal argument mounting globally that governments and corporations have a duty of care to protect citizens, consumers, and investors from risk. This is the international community. This is several countries that already have legislation in place for corporate accountability. These are countries that already have modern slavery and supply chain transparency and due diligence reporting mechanisms in place. Canada has none of these.